I want to talk a little bit about how I see the context in the U.S. today. And my basic claim is that there is no toxicity about Dewey because there is no Dewey. And which is such an irony given that we're in this wonderful conference of people from 25 countries, and we've seen these wonderful examples of schools and things like that where obviously, you know, a spirit of Dewey lives. So my basic claim is there is no Dewey. And as I asked Barbara Stengel the other day, I don't think that there's much of a discourse nor a practice of democracy. And this is set in, of course, a very complex current culture in the United States in which there are many, many challenges of insecurities. And insecurities including, obviously, things like racism and all the things that are going on with, yeah, I thought I was going to absolutely pass out the entire month of July. It was just horrible at home. The current election, both political parties are, nobody's talking about education at all because everybody's assuming the status quo of states competing for things like race for the top money and a climate of standardized testing and things. There is, well, we don't even want to get into the current election. I'll be glad to take comments about that later on. When I go to meetings now, I have a little stopwatch, and I wait to see how many seconds it is before people start asking me about Donald Trump. It comes to about 30 seconds, actually. Just joking.
What's your answer?
Well, you probably can guess. Anyway, so I think that, so at the level of politics, I mean, our politicians haven't read Dewey. They don't pay any attention basically to educators or to even to educational research or educational theory, let alone that somebody should ask, you know, come and interview me, right, about what I think about local schools or something like that. I think a lot of it has to do, in the US at least, with the hierarchy of the academy. The schools of education, colleges of education, however big they are at the very low level of a hierarchy in which arts and sciences and those traditional departments rule the roost. And heaven forbid that they'd want to talk to educators, for instance, about educational philosophy, for instance. And the general view is that all we do in schools of education is train teachers, which of course is a part of what we do, and that there's no valuable scholarship going on unless it's some kind of measured scholarship having to do with things like the place of standardized test scores. So let me talk a little bit. I'm going to talk about some areas here. I'm going to talk about schooling practices because I think there's some things going on there which I would like to change. I'm going to talk about the research community and teacher education and say some things, for instance, about critical theory, so I'm going to be a little provocative here. I'm going to talk about how I see Dewey falling on deaf ears and the fact that even my colleagues don't want to talk about Dewey. And I'm going to make a final comment about the fact that we're emphasizing knowledge and achievement with such emphasis that we've forgotten about things like ethics and ethos and the kinds of things that we ought to have in schools. And then I'm going to conclude by telling you just a teeny little bit about some of my own work, if you don't mind, on what I'm calling small democracies. And I'm not without hope, but we may have to look outside the school to think about the kinds of organization and the kinds of operations that we could then bring into the school, for instance, to do things like change professional learning communities, which is also one of my current favorites. Okay, so as you well know and can understand, there's a lot of inequality in American schools and schooling, and some schools, like in the university town where I live, are considered to be really good schools. All their parents like them. There's an interesting irony that all the professors that I know send their kids to the local friend's school, even though we have, quote unquote, the best schools in the state. But there's a wide range in terms, obviously, of resources. There's the whole problem of inner city schools that people like Jonathan Kozol write about. I mean, the shame of the nation is just incredible. Wait till I talk about silent lunches and hand signals. And there's a whole emphasis on standardized tests, especially in schools of the kids of the poor. The traditional curriculum in which college readiness is basically the only thing in terms of the curriculum that gets emphasized, and a whole range of strict discipline. One of the things that I'm writing about has to do with mass incarceration and what we call in the US the school-to-prison pipeline. And all but begun, by the way, in the name of things like the drug culture in the 90s that put all kinds of young people, especially minority males, in prisons So we have the highest incarceration rate of any country in the world. And we have a huge privatization of prisons and the building of prisons. In my state in North Carolina, they're just building them everywhere. And off go the kids who, once they get into prison, right, come out and basically are disenfranchised, literally disenfranchised in so many ways for the rest of their lives. I did see, by the way, maybe Darren will know, a state the other day I saw in the newspaper is actually reconsidering, Virginia, I think it is reconsidering the idea of having former felons be able to reapply for franchise. So there may be, some hope there. So let me talk about some of my favorite school practices. Silent lunch. So we went to this wonderful school yesterday where you saw these wonderful tables for 8 with a teacher and kids having lunch. By the way, my major professor, Nell Noddings, for instance, has written about that for years. And one of my undergraduates, a lovely African-American woman in my class on youth and schools not too long ago said, I thought everybody had silent lunch. So here's this idea: in some schools you get 10 minutes of silent lunch, in some schools the entire lunch period is silent, and can you imagine the whole idea of somehow us engendering some kind of feeling of community and democracy and things when kids can't even talk to one another? It's just disgusting. One of my other favorites is in-school suspension. I love this one. A kid arrives late to class in the morning because he's been out helping his peers get to school down, get on the bus, and everybody, by the way, in North Carolina is bused. And he arrives late to school, and so instead of having the kid come in, I taught in a poor school in California for many years, and I had hot chocolate in my room every morning so that when the kids came, they would have, something to drink. And I wouldn't send them to the office, or, by the way, in-school suspension usually takes place in libraries. So that's really great too, right? What does it say about libraries, right? And then, of course, in my state, we have the whole problem today of transgender bathrooms and HB2. And if you know anything about what's going on, it's causing this huge hullabaloo. And our current governor, by the way, has an ad in which he basically talked about the safety of little children, in a sense, in transgender bathrooms, with no evidence, by the way, that there's any kind of danger there. Some of the other things that have been proposed are things like the possibility of teachers carrying guns into school. Can you think of anything more preposterous? I mean, the very idea, you get hand carry, you can get, it just blows my mind, I have to say. So the other thing that I'm concerned about in school, of course, is that there's virtually no democracy. Teachers have very little control over what they do. It's not that they're not resisting, right? But they basically don't have a lot of say in what the curriculum is. Curriculum comes from each of our states, comes from the top. There's, again, competition for money to be able to have resources. And there are very few student experiences. I mean, the very idea yesterday that we saw, this idea that kids would be out, in the field and those kinds of things. I mean, kids get locked into schools in the United States, locked in. I just thought, can you imagine? So we've got, these horrible experiences of school violence and people coming in and shooting up the schools, but kids can't even get out because the doors are locked once they get there. So I'm concerned about that, and I'm also concerned about what the response to the research community, to teacher education, and to educational theory to this. And this is the part where you're going to go, oh God, she's doing that. But let me tell you what I think. I teach in a quite well-regarded school of education, and I get to teach one little course in which I have one little piece of Dewey, and I'm the only philosopher in the institution. And the entire discourse in our school of education has to do with social justice. I'm all for social justice, right? But what it does is it completely shuts out other discourses. And it has to do with things like minority achievement. I'm all for minority achievement, but the problem with the discourse is that there are no other discourses that get allowed. And that's my pick, by the way, at the Freireans. I'm sorry, but nobody criticizes Freire in the US, right? These Freirean centers, a place like UCLA, and heaven forbid that there should be a critical literature. That's ridiculous. And anyone who is a pragmatist knows that we're going to have to take multiple routes to reform, and we're going to have to learn to talk together, even if we disagree. And do we recognize conflict? I know that, but not very much. And he really did think in something like the great community that we were going to be able to, to come together in some kind of consensual discourse and some kind of consensual practice. And I think, by the way, that that's probably outdated today. So there's very little reading and by the way, I think that the traditional progressive thing is exactly right. It's, that's going on too. Dewey's considered to be old-fashioned. Teachers do have things like group work, but, heaven forbid that we should talk about where it comes from and how it should work. He's considered to be too touchy-feely. There's no discussion of democracy. And back to the level of social justice, everything is talked about in terms of structures, positionalities, which is another one of my favorites, and identities and identity politics. And there's no discussion about, if you're going to get to school reform and do something about social justice, how you get there. It's just, all right, we're going to change the structures, we're going to change the inequality, maybe we're going to have revolution, Bernie Sanders to the contrary, but there's no pragmatist sense here about how we're going to get there. By the way, I want to recommend someone to you who is the other Deweyan on the university faculty. His name is John McGowan. And if you don't know John McGowan's work, he wrote a terrific book on pragmatist politics and on big theory. I'm interested in little theory, but he wrote it on big theory that was published in 2012, and he's really good. So let me make a comment then. What I'd like to do is I'm trying to figure out in my own thinking what it would mean to have small democracies. And I wrote a paper on association and Dewey for the 100-year thing. And I've been looking at things like, for instance, the kinds of theory that goes into things like British labor unions with Paul Hirst, who I found out wasn't the Paul Hirst that I knew of. So I learned that recently. There are two Paul Hirsts, right? I think that we need to think about local communities. In the U.S., in most of the places we live, or at least the ones I know, there's a lot of diversity already. So what I want us to do is to have small little ways that we join together to solve everyday problems that get beneath politics. Because at the national level, we've got a divided culture. Nobody can talk to one another. The budget's coming up again in the next few weeks, and we'll end up, with no budget again. So I want us to think about how we might do that in very close ways. I'll tell you the joke to end. The joke is that for a couple of years, my example was my homeowners association. Because I live in a small condominium complex in this lovely little town, and we got along perfectly well until we got into fights over the grounds. And I'm on the board, and I have, because I own two, and I get to vote, but I was outvoted because the president, who does most of the work, picked her friend to be the gardener. And this is the difference in our views. It's sort of a microcosm of the US, right? I called the front of my condominium my front yard, and the gardener the gardener that she hired called it our parking lot. So she's turning our front into a parking lot. And I, in my own form of resistance, have built a lovely little Japanese garden in the back of my condo so that I could look out the back and be happy. So I think we need to think about coming together, thinking about taking our differences into account, talking about our conflicts in the kind of way, for instance, that Chantal Mouffe talks about them. I think one of the places we could make some difference in the US in schools is in professional learning communities. But at this point, professional learning communities, at least from what I can tell, first of all, they're mandated from the state level to the schools. The first wave of work that the teachers were mandated to do was to develop test items. And from what I can tell, they do things like spend their time more lesson planning. Not against lesson planning, think that's fine, glad to have people join together, but think about if we could sort of infuse a discourse there so the teachers would begin to see themselves democratically, working together democratically, and then do the kind of thing in terms of modeling and working with students to do the same kind of thing. So I'm not without hope. I don't see us changing from this national culture in any way quickly, but I think there are ways that we can, in my sense, update Dewey to think about the kinds of suggestions that his work can give us. Thanks.